Well, good afternoon to you. It is now 4:06, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up, Philip Lenczycki joins us this hour. We talk China with him, a whole bunch of things, including who set up that trip for Gavin Newsom to go and violate, what is it, the Logan Act? Where you remember that rule? You're not allowed to negotiate on behalf of the United States if you're just some random person. Well, Gavin Newsom's a random person. Shouldn't he be locked up for that? They made Mike Flynn's life a living hell. Let's do it to Gavin Newsom. Let's do that. Also, Dr. Marty McCary will join us at 5:30 today. We talked to him about the uptake for the new COVID jab is virtually nothing. Almost no American wants to get this thing, following the tradition they started with their own children. You know that nobody's getting the COVID jab for their kids? There's a lot of adults out there who decided to take the bullet for their family. They're like, yeah, okay, yeah, whatever, okay, yeah, I'll get it. But then when it came to their kids, they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. We're not a chance we're doing that. The uptake for that has been very low for a long time. Even, I should point out, among some of your most left-wing friends. Oh yeah, no, eventually, maybe we'll get it for the kids. And they don't. They know better. They're like, no, this is stupid. Why would I do that? Kids healthy. They're fine. So now 97% of the public has said no thanks to the latest round of COVID jabs. And Dr. Marty McCary will weigh in on that subject. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL today. And always. You know, we've got a hearing today, a couple of hearings today from Biden officials. Tony Blinken was before the Senate Appropriations Committee in order to try and argue for more money. We'll get into that coming up. We also have Secretary Mayorkas, DHS Secretary, who should have been impeached and thrown out, probably in prison a long time ago. And then we had FBI Director Chris Wray, who similarly should be ejected from the government. The two of them were testifying before the Senate Homeland Security Committee today. And that is where they revealed, they're sorry to say, that the Joe Biden presidency is a lot more dangerous than the Donald Trump presidency. Now, those, of course, are not the words that they used today. But the threat picture that they painted is that things are bad right now. And they've gotten a lot worse under Joe Biden. Here's FBI Director Christopher Wray being asked by Florida Senator Rick Scott today about whether or not the United States is safer with Joe Biden as president. Here's the answer.
Is the United States safer from foreign terror threats today? Are we safer than when Joe Biden took office, from the day he took office?
He knows. He knows.
What I would say to you is that the terror threats have elevated, but I also think there are a lot of things the country has done throughout law enforcement to be better prepared to deal with them.
Oh, man. He tried to figure out a way to wiggle out of this. He didn't even want to answer the question because there was no route, except for an explicit lie, that would afford him the opportunity to do that. How long was that pause? Do you really need to think about it that much? He wasn't thinking about the answer. He knew what the answer was. He was thinking about his career as he contemplated what was going to come out of his mouth next. And he says the terror threats have elevated. Let me put that differently. America is a lot more vulnerable now to terror attacks than it was under Donald Trump. That's the FBI director saying that. Additionally, Chris Wray warned that Hamas terrorists are readying and may even commit terror attacks right here on American soil. Listen.
But as I said a few moments ago, on top of the homegrown violent extremists and domestic violent extremist threat, we also cannot and do not discount the possibility that Hamas or another foreign terrorist organization may exploit the current conflict to conduct attacks here on our own soil. We have kept our sights on Hamas and have multiple ongoing investigations into individuals affiliated with that foreign terrorist organization.
Multiple. Get back to me when it's one of your highest priorities. You know what the highest priority of the FBI is these days? Going after American citizens who voted for the other guy. That's their highest priority. They brag about it. They put statements out. The Justice Department, the FBI, the biggest investigation in American history is into the riot of January 6th, into the events of January 6th. People went into the Capitol building. Didn't you hear about this? Thousands of people need to be prosecuted. Their lives need to be destroyed. They need to be hunted down for years. They need to be locked up in prison, and the key needs to be thrown away. All because they expressed animosity about Joe Biden. They need to go. Who do they think they are? How dare you walk into the United States Congress? And so that's been the FBI's priority. They're constantly, remember was it during the Philadelphia speech that Biden gave? Remember that? The blood red speech in Philadelphia, where he stands up there and he says, the real threat to our country right now are MAGA extremists. And he said it over and over and over again. MAGA extremists, MAGA extremists. They're the real threat. They don't believe in democracy. We need to bring back decency. Biden loves to talk about Charlottesville and those anti-Semitic lunatics that were in the streets, carrying around torches, chanting about Jews. Biden's party is overtaken by those types of identitarian anti-Semitic lunatics right now. In numbers we can't even count. And these guys are up there saying, the real threat to this country, MAGA extremists. They've been saying over and over. They say it so much that Corinne got in trouble for it. Remember that? In trouble. It was the gentlest of wrist slaps, but they say she violated the Hatch Act. Ahead of the midterm, she kept talking about MAGA extremists, MAGA this, MAGA that. And eventually, the government body responsible for assessing whether or not it's a violation of the Hatch Act, that is using your tax dollars to campaign again in a political way, says, yeah, she violated the Hatch Act. Don't you do it again. There will be no meaningful penalty, but don't you do it again. And she never stopped, of course. In fact, yesterday, in the White House press briefing, Corinne was asked about this by Peter Doocy. Wait a second. You've been calling your political opponents extremists over and over and over again. Can't you just say the people who are supporting terrorism, actual terrorism, the ones who are posting images of Hamas paragliders that were used to attack Jewish people in Israel, behead them, murder them, decapitate them, yes, in some cases, destroy families. Can't you say that the people who support those guys are kind of extreme? Wouldn't you say?
Does President Biden think the anti-Israel protesters in this country are extremists?
What I can say is what we've been very clear about this. When it comes to anti-Semitism, there is no place. We have to make sure that we speak against it very loud and be very clear about that. Remember, what the president when the president decided to run for president is what he saw in Charlottesville in 2017, when he saw neo-Nazis marching down the streets of Charlottesville with vile anti-Semitic just hatred. And he was very clear then, and he's very clear now. He's taken actions against this over the past 2 years, and he's continued to be clear.
So those lunatics in Charlottesville, the ones who were carrying the torches, and let me point out, they've also ruined torches. Have you noticed they ruined patio torches for everybody? You're trying to keep the mosquitoes away, a little citronella. You're at the store and you're like, don't judge me, I've got mosquitoes. But those guys, they were chanting, what were they chanting? Jews will not replace us. Remember that? The stupidity of it all. And so Biden runs because he says, we've got to stop that. We've got to make America more decent. We've got to root out any even little tiny semblance of anti-Semitism. It's got to be destroyed, right? What has he done? What is show me the results of your work. What has happened to our country? Holy cow, he made things so much worse, didn't he? So now we have a picture here of what the Biden presidency has been. And of course, this has all come into stark relief for you in so many different ways, including probably your bank account. Definitely the crime near your house and in your community. But now we have a picture where you've got Biden officials openly admitting to Congress today, yeah, America's a lot less safe with Biden as president. Pregnant pause, the threats have elevated, says Christopher Wray. And then when Coringe is asked, hey, what about actual extremism? Are you guys going to condemn that at all? Are you going to refer to it as extremism, or is language like that only reserved for people who vote for the other party? And she can't even say it. She can't even bring herself to say, yeah, that's extreme. The people, if you support beheading children and Israeli adults, Jewish people, you're an extremist. You're an extremist. If you support that, you're a full-blown extremist. No question. You're a lost soul. And nothing out of her. She still trying to hold on to the extremist vote, I guess. Don't call them extremists. That's what Coringe did yesterday. I've got another cut for you. This was cut 6 here. Corey, is this from today or yesterday? This is Coringe asked about calling MAGA extremists but not anti-Israelis. Is this yesterday's? Yeah. Okay, so this is a little bit more from yesterday. I know this is continuing to be an issue today. Here's a little bit more from Coringe.
We hear you guys, though, talk about extremists all the time. It is usually about MAGA extremists. So what about these protesters who are making Jewish students feel unsafe on college campuses? Are they extremists?
I've been very, very clear. We are calling out any form of hate. Any form of hate.
You remember when Congress was drafting a resolution to condemn Ilhan Omar for something she had done that was anti-Semitic? And the resolution began as a denunciation of her, and it specifically said what she did. And then by the end of it, Nancy Pelosi and company had watered it down to the point that they generically said that they opposed hatred. And there was nothing specific in the resolution anymore. It had no value whatsoever. Okay, we're against hatred. It didn't even mean anything. Like it had wandered away from the specificity that it had started with. And Coringe is doing the same thing. I have been so very clear. If I haven't been clear enough, let me be clear again. We oppose hatred. We denounce all hate, she says, generically. It reminds me a little bit of, remember when people were running around using in earnest and Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. And then somebody would come along and say, well, yes, of course, because all lives matter. And then they would be like, how dare you? How dare you? What are you, a bigot by saying all lives matter? Well, I truly think that. I really do. So why would I distinguish between white? How dare you? It was a racist thing. And the argument they would offer is, to the extent that you heard a good faith argument, was like, well, don't you diminish the need to protect black people right now by just saying all lives matter. You need to focus on this. This is the real pressing issue. So when Peter Doocy asks, like, hey, you're going to condemn some extremism here, you've got Jewish students on campus who are literally being told to hide from some of their fellow classmates. And she's like, well, we're just generically opposed to hatred. I'm sorry. I want to go back to this rule that you people invented before. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that.
Out any form of hate. Any form of hate. It is not acceptable. It should not be acceptable here, and we are going to continue to call that out. And let me be very clear. This is a president that has continued to have that fight in his office, in this administration. You know, when he repealed Trump's Muslim ban on his first day in office, that is something that this president did.
Let me remind people that so-called Muslim ban was literally just a ban on migration from countries that were high terror threats. That list, you ready for who assembled it? That was Obama and Biden who put that list together. Trump just used it. He just said, okay, that list. Let's use that list. We'll stop the terror countries from sending people here.
He also established an inter-policy committee to counter Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and related forms of bias and discrimination. We have taken this very, very, very seriously.
She said it 3 times. That's how seriously they're taking it. Although she won't accuse the anti-Jewish people of being extremists or anything. They haven't taken it 4 varies, only 3. Hold tight. I know your calls coming in and so much more next. Okay, let's go to the phones. We've got Chuck calling in from Triangle, Virginia. Chuck, you're on the Vince Coglianese Show.
So thanks. So one of the things I think being missed in the current debate is, you kind of alluded to this, the anti-Semites on the left, and that was Peter Doocy's question. Mm-hmm. But what's not being mentioned is where the anti-Semites are on the right. For example, the head of the KKK he's a knucklehead, and he lives in a very obscure town won't even say his name to give him that credit, but
I don't even know who that person would be. Like, honestly, Chuck, I literally would have to search for that. I have no idea who that person is.
Exactly. Yeah, I had to look it up again the other day when I was thinking about this. But structural racism is in our colleges, and it's embodied in critical theory,
yes,
which is what they teach. It's the Frankfurt School, and it's also in our government. It's applied in the acronym DEI. That's where it's embodied. The underlying principles are the same in both.
Yeah, definitely. And from the time that we were all little kids, Chuck, what did we learn about racial prejudice? It's the product of ignorance and the fear that is born out of that ignorance, right? And so wherever you find it on the political spectrum, it's always a very stupid ideology. The problem is when you have powerful institutions that wield it as a way for us to construct and order our society, it totally destroys everything. It's not based on any logic whatsoever other than the logic of fear and ignorance and destruction. And now we're living through it, aren't we, Chuck?
Absolutely, yeah. And there was bad things done at Charlottesville, certainly. There were bad people there.
Yeah.
But we have structural racism in our colleges. Yeah,
I know. It's true. It's why I always found it. I understood that the point that some on the right were making, like, what do you mean systemic racism? What you're talking about is a myth. No, what Chuck just described is actually accurate. We have lots of that going on. Our institutions are overtaken by this garbage, and it's enough is enough, right? We should be done with that. Coming up, Philip Lenczycki is going to talk to us about a country that is salivating at the prospect that our own insanity destroys us. China. That's ahead. Hey, good afternoon to you. 4:35 now, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up in the next hour, we'll be joined by Dr. Marty McCary at 5:30, and we'll discuss why Americans are now refusing to get the so-called COVID booster shots. And we'll chat with you at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. There's a tweet here from the writer Abigail Schreier, who is very bright and has written so much on all of the various left-wing crazes that have overtaken the country. She tweeted last night, or X'd last night, TikTok's propaganda algorithms helped convince an entire generation to support the massacre of Jews. Imagine what TikTok will do when we need to stand up to China. Kind of a fascinating thought experiment that, unfortunately, part of which we're living through right now. You're wondering, how is it that so many young people were pro-Hamas terrorist attack? Well, look no further than the fact that they were raised by strangers on the internet and that the algorithm itself was controlled by China. That seems to matter, doesn't it? China wields an extraordinary amount of influence in the tech space, in particular among young people, by way of TikTok. Another story we're seeing on China and tech right now is that China has erased Israel from all of its various websites that have maps on them. The Wall Street Journal reporting on that detail today. The Wall Street Journal says, let me pull this up for you, that Israel goes unnamed on China online maps. Internet users in China are expressing bewilderment that the name Israel doesn't appear on leading online digital maps from Baidu and Alibaba, an ambiguity that matches Beijing's vague diplomacy in the region and contrasts with its attentiveness to maps generally. Internet users in China are calling this out because this is not the way it was before. At some point it changed. It may have been very recently. And the Wall Street Journal is now reporting on it. For more on this, I want to turn to Philip Lenczycki, who joins us now. He's an investigative reporter for the Daily Caller News Foundation. Philip, good to have you with us.
Hi, Vince. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm doing well. Let me just start with China's influence on the internet. This caught my attention for sure, that China has now scrubbed its online maps of the existence of Israel. What are we to make of that?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So we've seen now for a while that China wages, some type of psychological map warfare, if you want to call it that, to advance its, political claims. So we've seen this, of course, again and again with, Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, the list goes on. You could ask any of its neighbors, really, and even in recent, couple of weeks or so, or maybe a month or so, even Russia kind of got this treatment with a small island that it shares on its border with China. So what we're seeing now is sort of falls into that category where by removing Israel from these online maps, China is sending a message. Now, I checked Baidu myself, and I can confirm that Israel is not listed, but if you use the search tab and you type in Israel in Chinese, it will take you to that region, number one. Number two, if you hover over it and you sort of just, place your cursor somewhere in there, Israel will also pop up somewhere else on the screen. So there's some type of, as you mentioned before a moment ago, some type of vagueness with how much they want to lean into this, I think.
Right, but it's clear that something has definitely changed. There was a change in the actual mapping here because, as the Wall Street Journal points out, they say it's being discussed like crazy right now by Chinese internet users since the war broke out. In other words, people who use the Chinese internet are noticing what appears to be a change in their policy. And it strikes me that this is designed, and you would know better, designed to breathe life into the chaos we're currently seeing in the Middle East.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I mean, we know that China and Russia, they have like this, no limits partnership. We know that Iran and China in 2021, they signed a 25-year, strategic partnership agreement. So we know where China sits and with whom it has chosen to ally itself. And Iran is a big deal here, right? So in this case, with Israel, it's clear that they're sending messages that they do not support Israel. We're seeing that again and again and again with how they're portraying the conflict on their news and how they're, of course, in this case with the maps. So I think that they're sending a signal that we should be picking up.
How badly, if at all, do you think China wants us, the United States, to be engaged in a war in the Middle East? Meaning that we send troops, that we engage militarily, perhaps with Iran. Is that something that China desires?
I would hate to think that we would get engaged in all these different conflicts. It's not that we shouldn't, support our allies. On the other hand, China definitely is looking for some type of opening, and I can only imagine that it would be something of, their wet dream to have us totally engaged around the world, overextended more than we already are, so that they can seize their moment and take Taiwan or do whatever else they wish to do.
So, look, I'm curious about this because obviously they are in it entirely for their own power and seeing that rise. But I do wonder to what extent that they may be hesitant to see us engaged in a war because it may cost them the ability to keep bringing in American money. They need American consumers to constantly be throwing cash at China. So those parallel needs, one, to try and diminish us as they rise and try and kind of take over the planet's system as the hegemon, as they say in political science, but simultaneously they're dependent on the American economy for an inflow of cash, right?
That's been the thinking now for a long time, that the Chinese Communist Party's, its legitimacy with the people of China was predicated upon, GDP growth. That's been the thinking now for a long time, but there's been more and more individuals saying, well, maybe we've moved on from that. And I think that personally, it might be a mistake to imagine that someone like Adolf Hitler is a rational actor. It wasn't maybe a particularly rational decision to launch a two-front war in World War II. We're dealing with megalomaniacs. And when you have an individual like that, and we have now multiple, for instance, Putin and Xi, that are, aging, they want to see things happen on their clock. So who knows what their calculus is? It might not be what we would hope it would be.
Yeah, it's also fascinating. Lastly, on this tech point, and then I want to move on to Xi Jinping specifically, but on this tech point, the tweet I read from Abigail Schreier at the top, which is that we're seeing so many young people basically root against Israel, root for Hamas, and she put it in very stark terms for the death of Jews. She says she's looking at it going, well, where did all these young people get these ideas? TikTok. TikTok is the most popular social media app among the youngest Americans. And she thinks that this is obviously telling us there's going to be a huge problem if China ends up doing something that hurts American interests pretty substantially, or even goes into a full-blown war with the United States. What do you make of that thinking about TikTok specifically?
Well, this one is a bit more difficult. I think that, we need to be very, very careful. China is a unique threat, and they are going to leverage this type of technology or businesses or anything that they can possibly use against us. They're going to take advantage of these things. We know that. So it presents a very, very difficult conundrum for us if we are interested in, free markets and these type of things. The main issue here is, can you have this type of relationship with a totalitarian power? And I would say the answer is no. You can't really have any relationship whatsoever with it. And so for TikTok specifically, it might be the best call to just have a clean break from it and designate it as whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if it's posing that type of threat to us, we might need to make that decision. I definitely don't trust what they've been telling us. And more hearing that, their executives are coming over from Beijing and populating, the high ranks of TikTok, we should be very, very concerned.
Yeah, big time. And your kids should not be on TikTok. Like, stop that in its tracks before it even starts. Let me move on to another issue. Gavin Newsom, the greasy governor of California, has just been spending the past week, I think, in China, visiting with all sorts of people, to include Xi Jinping, the leader of the country and the Communist Party there. Philip, how did this all go down? You've got some new reporting on this subject. How is it that Gavin Newsom ended up being America's emissary, whether we like it or not, to China this past week? What happened?
Yeah, this one, hopefully I can be a bit more eloquent here. Last Monday, Gavin Newsom went to China, and he went from city to city. He, started off his trip in Hong Kong, and then sort of went north, and he wound up bouncing from Beijing, and then I think he left out of Shanghai the day before today. And during this trip, what we found was that an organization called the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, that's a big name, they took credit last week on Thursday for inviting Newsom to China. But it turns out this organization in 2020, the State Department designated them as a quote-unquote affiliate of a Chinese intelligence service called the United Front Work Department. So somewhere in the past, we found some instances going back a few years where Newsom and others in California are participating in webinars concerning the climate with this organization. So somewhere back in the past, they're dealing with this group, and then now this group's taking credit for the trip entirely. And during this trip, on the same day that this organization, used their social media account to sort of take credit for his trip, Newsom met with the organization's head. His name is Yang Wanming, and there's a photo of that. And there's a couple other photos that we found throughout that same day, Thursday, where Newsom is on an escalator with the individual. Then there's another instance where there's some type of meeting between the Beijing Municipal Ecology and Environment Bureau and the California Air Resources Board, where Newsom's present, this individual's present, and they sign a memorandum of understanding. And later on, Newsom and this individual and some others attend a quote-unquote Great Wall Climate Dialogue. And there's a photo that's on Newsom's office's Flickr account that shows this meeting. There's a large, blue screen behind Newsom and this individual and others, and it says very clearly the name of this organization, the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, and it states that they are the host of this meeting. So this is very concerning, obviously, because that means that their office is not paying any heed whatsoever to what the State Department has warned.
So, okay. So in other words, China and the Chinese intelligence service in particular views Gavin Newsom as an obvious mark, as somebody they can exploit to advance their goals, right?
It certainly seems like elite capture to me.
It does seem like. So I'm going to quote from your article today on this subject. Again, the headline on the article is Chinese intel service affiliate takes credit for bringing Gavin Newsom to China. And this organization that you mentioned, the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, it's got a complicated acronym, but basically, again, it's an affiliate of the Chinese intel service. They say that, you say, and the State Department said back in 2020, that they assess that this is a Beijing-based organization, and it is tasked with co-opting subnational governments. That would be the governor of California. Co-opting subnational governments, and it is sought to directly and malignly influence state and local leaders to promote the PRC's global agenda. That is the Communist Party of China. And that was the 2020 assessment by the State Department. Has the State Department changed its assessment of this organization since then, to your knowledge?
Well, I contacted them, actually, and asked them about this specifically, and asked them if they still, stand behind that designation, and if they would warn against U.S. lawmakers meeting with this organization. And they responded that they had, quote unquote, nothing for me on this matter. So one can only imagine what's going on there.
So the United States Department of State is acting as Gavin Newsom's press shop today. They've decided to keep him away from scandal by telling you they have no update for you. You don't need to answer that.
Apparently,
I'm concluding that.
Well, what are you going to say? I mean, we got Nicholas Burns over there, right? Mm-hmm. Who's obviously aware of what's going on. So Nicholas Burns being, the ambassador over there in Beijing for the U.S. So he's got to know what's going on.
Finally, I don't know how closely you've paid attention to this particular issue, but obviously you've paid attention to Gavin Newsom going to China. I seem to recall that if a U.S. official or any American citizen goes and engages in bilateral negotiations with a country while not actually being a member of the federal government, they're supposedly violating something called the Logan Act. Is that in play here?
That's funny you mentioned that. I actually, came across U.S. versus, California, that I believe what you're referring to today. And they sued California before about something related to this. So I'm wondering the same, how they are able to make these type of agreements. I am not an attorney, so I can't really speak to that.
Right.
But it certainly seems concerning when the entities in play that are hosting these type of events happen to be a Chinese intelligence service affiliate.
Yeah, unless we find out that Biden actually commissioned Gavin Newsom to go do this, and maybe we'll find that out at some point. But for now, it doesn't appear to be that way. He just seems like a mark that the Chinese government is exploiting, and it's at our expense. Thank you very much, Philip Lenczycki over at the Daily Caller News Foundation, for always being all over these stories. Really appreciate your time today, sir. Coming up, we got a lot of breaking news today. I've got some good audio to share with you on the events that were occurring while you were busy at work. Also, crime in Washington, D.C., kind of out of control. So out of control, the D.C. mayor is now saying something about it. She thinks, maybe carjacking someone 7 times is probably enough to have you locked up for a little bit longer than an hour. We'll get into the details of what's happening there and the fight that's being kicked off on the left over all of this crime. It's ahead on the Vince Coglianese Show.